No, the solution is not to just build more houses, and landlords are still parasitic middlemen that profit from necessity. You know, it's funny because the last video I made on the subject had many right-wingers agree. Those being Georges, voluntarists, and other right-wing libertarians. I'm looking at you, Israelite biblical chanting 1009. Thanks for the support, man. Let's revisit a topic I briefly covered 4 years ago, this time exploring it in much greater depth. This video examined the issues that landlords and property management companies exacerbate regarding housing prices and offers a Marxist perspective on housing. I'll also attempt to respond to some arguments raised in response to this video, of course with a touch of my discipline, urban planning. It is foremost important to briefly clarify the role landlords have in the capitalist system. Engels wrote a series of articles in the 1870s, right after the Franco-Prussian War, discussing the dialectic between the petit bourgeoisies and Proudhon's perspectives on the housing crisis. Workers were flooding into towns across Germany while large-scale demolitions of dwellings took place to make way for wider roads, railways, and similar projects. As a result, a housing shortage quickly arose, impacting not only workers, the proletarians, but also the petit bourgeoisie, aka the shop owners. Proudhon argued that this relationship resembled workers being exploited by the capitalist class. But Engels belittled him and corrected him on this matter. He asserted that it was a seller-buyer relationship, with the seller having the upper hand in this situation. Since in this case the tenant isn't selling their labor power, but rather buying the commodity of housing, which includes the flat's maintenance costs and a surplus margin that covers the landlord's mortgage plus a profit margin. A significant point is that capitalism allows this to happen initially. A communist mode of production that secures housing for everyone results in lower rents, higher homeownership rates, and eliminates homelessness. Not through neoliberal means, like killing them, but by providing homes. I believe that land and housing should not be private property to enrich landlords, but instead be part of well-planned developments that are affordable, ensure housing for all, and feature walkable communities with mixed-use buildings, shops, restaurants, schools, pharmacies, and even more. I not only think this basic good should be decommodified, but it should be integrated into sustainable communities that actually allow degrowth and an end to this climate crisis and housing crisis. I made this point in an earlier video on the subject back in 2021, and I think it needed to be reiterated and expanded upon. If I were to own a piece of land between a town and a water reservoir, and proceeded to charge a fee so the people in the town had access to the water, then I don't create any value. All I do is sit on land and extract wealth from a basic necessity, without which people die. The point here being made is that the state can and should provide basic amenities such as water for free or cheaply, or just not impede on the right of people to have this resource in the first place, because it's necessary for survival. Water, electricity, and sewage systems should never be controlled by single or multiple private entities that run on a profit motive. No factors cuts out the tedious process of getting water. It just upcharges people for a service that could be gotten for free from a worker state, which works much differently than a private enterprise, without a profit motive. This is for the same reason that streetlights aren't privatized. How do you expect to make a profit from it? Once the housing is built and the cost of operation is fulfilled, the mortgage is paid, their role is to sit on the property and extract wealth from buyers or renters in a more precarious position than them. Though I kind of view this as a kind of spectrum, with large property management companies being the big boogeyman, unironically. And duplex owners as people who just bought this property out of self-interest. They just want to live in a part, rent the other. But a proper analysis of landlording necessitates an acknowledgement that the market is very much so centralized into the hands of conglomerates like Blackstone. Furthermore, the point being made here is not to point a finger at individuals taking advantage of a system that screws them over if they don't walk all over their fellow workers. It's a critique of a system that bastardizes housing itself, treating it as a commodity to be sold for a profit, to be bought as an investment, to be rented out as a stream of income. The only way to get rid of this intrinsic characteristic of housing under capitalism is to build non-market units and overthrow the capitalist system. Let's go even further with this analysis, refuting arguments made by Hampton, or Russian capitalist, in a response video he made about 4 years ago, which he has since privated. I will still leave a link in the description down below if he ever decides to unprivate it.
Landlords don't just sit on property. Landlords homestead that property and maintain it and upkeep it. They're the ones who must spend money on repairs, on damaged pieces of property, to expand the property. They're the ones who take the financial burden if there's an economic downer. What they do is cutting out the cost of, one, having to buy a house themselves and the time and money it would take to upkeep it. They lower the cost of housing. Instead of purchasing a house for $600K in California, a landlord could charge you only $500 to $600 a month.
Lots to unpack here. First, they do just sit on property. They monopolize the market to profit from this necessity. Sure, they might have to handle the repairs, but that's an extremely weak argument used to justify the existence of landlords. They don't take any more financial risks buying property, considering the steady rise in the cost of housing and property prices. And they upcharge people for often more than the price of a mortgage. Well, of course, they're landlords, which tenants can usually not afford in combination with a down payment. It sends them down a vicious circle of renting at market price and spending a large part of their income, usually much more than the usual 30%, simply to fill the already full pockets of a landlord. I'd really love to see Hampton find a market price housing unit rent for less than $1,000 a month, let alone $500. This guy's out of touch with reality. In fact, the average rent for a studio apartment in California for 2022 was $1,538 and $1,854 for a one-bedroom. And the national average for a two-bedroom in the US was $1,295. And Hampton mentioned a house, not an apartment. So 8 times that, about $4,000 a month. So this profitability is evident when we look at places such as the Olympic Village in Vancouver, where market priced units priced at $2,900 to $4,000 a month exist right next to housing co-ops who charge only $1,000 a month because the mortgage is paid off and they only need to afford the maintenance. And why do cities still allow people to build complexes that are purely meant to be rented out as Airbnbs? I was an inspector for the city of Quebec throughout 2024, assigned to a survey of unused dwellings in mixed-use buildings throughout the old part of town. And it was alarming to see the amount of times I happened to inspect residential dwellings, just to see lockboxes on every door, with each unit having 0 personal belongings, a fan running in the middle of the room, folding beds in the corner, and a magnificent little portfolio with the Wi-Fi passwords and all that stuff, like things to do in the city. Another reason for the rising price of housing is obviously the massive surge in single-family suburban development, which makes a horrible use of land and creates a scarcity that doesn't need to exist, paired with horrible zoning laws that restrict what's being built. Landlords certainly don't help to make housing affordable. You can't argue otherwise without knowingly being wrong. Most landlords skip the paperwork by taking a fraction of the rent and hiring a property management firm, who then deals with everything. Even if the landlord does some work, they're not taking a wage or salary just for the paperwork or the groundskeeping. They're extracting above and beyond the value they provide. We also have a problem in a lot of cities now where landlords are raising rates if there is any increase in wages or an influx of higher wage jobs, so they can intercept any community growth in its infancy or their profit. They argue that they're just following the markets, as if they are not the market themselves.
Sure, you could cut out the middleman, but that would just raise costs. Even then, a landlord paying someone to repair something on a property, how? Is that a parasitic relationship and an expense that's worth being cut out? The value the landlord provides is the formula I've just created.
This is just hiring a contractor like everybody else does. It does not create any more value that justifies exorbitant upcharges and does not cut out any labor, since a tenant with a rent-to-own scheme or in a housing co-op could just as easily get those services without that upcharge. The value provided is directly correlated to the labor hours the contractor puts in. The parasitic relationship is very clear. A landlord extracts value from a necessity, which can be provided for much cheaper without profit from non-parasitic actors. This parasitic relationship can be minimized with pressure from housing co-ops. One such development exists near my home where the residents collectively own the building, share amenities and groceries, have a community garden, cars, even a thrift store. It's awesome. Not only do these co-ops bypass this parasitic middleman, but it lightens alienation by bringing a sense of community.
The landlords pay for the property and are usually responsible for repairs and maintenance. They might not be contributing much to the continued success, but they did take the initial risk by buying or building the structure.
How is it a risk to buy a house? Everyone needs a place to live. The only real risk you take is that no one would want to pay the extraordinary sum asked for living in your shitty property, in which case you'll have to lower the price. What's the worst that could happen? You're gonna have multiple pieces of property and you're gonna have to pay your mortgage like everyone else. You won't be begging on the street, unlike the people who rent from you, who are taking the real risk of going bankrupt or into debt to pay for their residence, being saddled with an abusive landlord or becoming homeless. It's not the case. The economy doesn't work that way. In non-profit housing, affordable housing mandates and co-ops destroy this argument. They drive down costs all around the city since market prices are not natural. It's not a natural law, a natural science, it's capitalism. Only way to get rid of this mess is to lead a successful revolution, overthrow capitalism, establish a worker democracy, and decommodify housing. Of course, we live in a capitalist world, and it is utterly idealistic to think we can just abolish it overnight without an organized workers' party. Thus, I believe that in the meantime, the solution to this problem in a reformist framework begins at the local level. So I must ask myself, what would you do if you were elected mayor of your city? Well, the city should promote housing co-ops, build social housing, and implement rent control to push out private developers that are just motivated by greed. Reformist discussion on the topic of building houses often only addresses privately developed affordable housing, ignoring co-ops, public housing, and other policies such as strictly regulating Airbnbs, rent control, and subsidies that work to make housing affordable. The arguments against these policies do not consider public housing at all, nor mixed income development, just grouping poor people together and imposing price controls. Of course, if you just cap rent and do nothing else to recoup the lost housing units, there will be issues. These solutions work together, not stand alone. Arguing otherwise is turning the pro-tenant argument into a strawman, entirely misrepresenting it and ignoring the actual solution supported by empirical evidence / real-world data. It's like taking a bunch of protein shakes without going to the gym and expecting results. You need to work out to beat up fascists with your bare fists. Policy-wise, in a reformist framework again, we need public housing mandates imposed on private development, paired with a rent cap, since this former policy usually incentivizes landlords to raise the rents on the private units to make up the lost potential profit from the mandated public housing unit. Mixed income zoning, investments in active and public transit, mixed-use zoning laws, all these policies increase the value produced per acre in each neighborhood, reduces housing prices, and increases revenues to the city, which can in turn be used for infrastructure improvements, bike lanes, public services, transit lines, parks, trees, and other amenities. To be fair, the libertarians do have a point about zoning laws being sometimes quite harmful. Forcing the community to build single-family homes in an array of car-centric developments not only plunges the city into debt the moment these roads need maintenance, but there is then no incentive or possibility to build proper public transit infrastructure. This type of Euclidean zoning also further hinders communities by isolating the work, home, and third place environments. Proper zoning policy would allow mixed-use neighborhoods and front yard businesses like cafes, haberdashers, tailors, thrift stores, the list goes on. I really like how Portland, Maine did this in the downtown with a lot of mixed-use buildings and frontier businesses. However, again, deregulation is not a solution. Not making multiple incomes converge into the same building or neighborhood will lead to either gentrification or a cycle of poverty and inequality in funding when it comes to education and healthcare. So yeah, policy isn't a one-size-fits-all. For example, Berlin excludes new buildings from rent control, and it has been kind of effective. One effective policy was brought up by Unlearning Economics in his response to Abigail Thorne about 5 years ago. He cited Murray and argued that a land value tax on undeveloped prime real estate location would make it unprofitable for developers to hoard the land and wait for it to rise in price due to scarcity. This is what Georgism is about. A single tax on unproductive land. Though I don't think it should be the only single tax. Instead, it would be more profitable for them to build commercial and residential units that would both bring in good revenue to the city, but also to the landlord, all while adding rental units to the housing market. Mixed-use zoning is a very strong component at the core of the new urbanist movement, which advocates for a return to the traditional way of organizing a city on a human scale, along transit lines. Furthermore, planning in a city in a way that promotes active transit is one of the best ways to ensure that you will have a healthier population. This is one of the main reasons why Norway hasn't built a single old people home since 1987. People walk, people are active, people eat well. I had this very nice active transit experience while in Paris. More specifically, the 14th neighborhood, the one with the catacombs. Pretty much every building was mixed use, and every location was in walking, biking, or metro distance. Getting groceries daily was really nice. I always passed by the local Carrefour by foot to grab a bag of groceries that was well enough for a few meals. Another thing that isn't talked about is the use of third places as community builders. Locations to hang out, exchange ideas, have a good time, and build meaningful relationships. In urban North America, this third place, previously a pub, library, public square, is kind of gone, since suburban developments are simply single-family homes on miles on end without any life on. This is part of how the capitalists control us. They don't want us to socialize and to gain class consciousness. Breaking down social silos and negating the isolation of the elderly, increasing socialization in an increasingly individualist society is extremely important to maintain a strong social cohesion, collective mental well-being, and so on and so forth. One neighborhood in my area, called Saint-Jean-Baptiste in downtown Quebec City, formed a tenant union in 1976, which in turn formed many committees aimed towards dismantling harmful practices, such as Airbnbs. The union also opened a thrift store, a community garden, and made significant progress in freeing empty units that were rented out by Airbnbs, which was putting an upward stress on the housing market. After Quebec's new zoning restriction policy and redirection of responsibilities regarding illegal hotel businesses towards Revenu Québec, the neighborhood saw its amount of Airbnbs drop from 180 down to 80, only illegal ones, which represents a 3% total increase in housing availability, which cooled down the market, brought down rent, and allowed lower-income residents to keep living there at an affordable price. So citizen action and government intervention here were the reason housing prices were able to be brought down and the gentrification to be in a way reversed. Something I need to stress is that not all renting is inherently bad. A lot of people must move often or prefer to rent an apartment rather than having to own it, since they plan to move out anyways. Buying and selling is kind of a hassle. That would account for a non-negligible portion of renters. However, the problem lays with individuals and corporations who buy up housing stock, renting it at exorbitant prices, often above the 30% of income of the tenants, preventing affordable housing and home ownership. Public housing for those who wish to rent rather than own, or who cannot afford a mortgage, is necessary. So you know this segment was coming. I am a marxist-leninist. The reformist talking points I peddle throughout this video are concrete policy and urban planning practices that I legitimately believe in. But they're not an end-all be-all. We have examples of people buying up housing co-ops to turn them into market housing, and just like any pro-worker and pro-tenant progressive policy, austerity measures and conservative governments have the power to dismantle them. It's already happening with healthcare and other social programs all throughout the imperial core. There's no escape from this crisis within capitalism. As my RCI comrade Leroy James put it in a 2021 article, quality, affordable housing should be a right for everyone. Yet this is impossible in a system based on profit-making and economic concentration. Instead of foreclosures driving new rounds of private concentration, the IMT calls for the nationalization of foreclosed and vacant homes to be allocated to those in need as part of a voluntary socialized plan for housing operated under democratic public control. In the final analysis, only the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of a socialist workers' government can resolve the housing crisis in the interest of the majority. I suggest you go read the full article, it's pretty interesting, and it's from the party I'm a member of. They call us Trotskyists, but really they're just wrong. It is still worth exploring urban planning and housing policies that would maximize quality of life and efficiency under socialism. For a quick rundown, I suggest you check out Hakim's video on Commie Blocks and City Beautiful's coverage of how Soviet cities were planned. The coverage was surprisingly positive and not really biased towards capitalism. There is definitely a certain genius in planning basic amenities like grocery stores, drugstores, workplaces, and third places like bars, cafes, and parks in the worker dwellings. But again, it's not the 1950s anymore. We have access to more resources than post-war USSR when building the Khrushchevkas. Nationalizing housing, encouraging mixed-use buildings, and accelerating the development of public transit infrastructure will lead to a healthier, happier population. So don't give in to neoliberal talking points, participate in municipal politics, and organize with your community to make housing more affordable, and eventually educate yourself and your comrades to overthrow capitalism. So yeah, thank you all for watching this video. You can support me on Ko-fi if you want, with a small donation, and I strongly encourage you to join your local communist party to work towards a better future. Thank you, and have a great day.